Hello and welcome to all the men and women of the West. I'm Joe, here with me is my co-host Dan.
Hello and greetings.
Let's get on with this A Link to the Past podcast, which is going to be a blast, because we're going to be examining every chapter, every square inch of this story, to the utmost of our abilities, as though it were a chapter-by-chapter novel. We're not really going to do a playthrough exactly. We are going to show some of the gameplay, but we're mostly going to chop it up, and we're going to use different images and whatnot here and there where we feel it necessary, because this is mostly an examination of the characters and of the story of A Link to the Past. And we're also going to talk about the lore, because that's necessary. It's fantasy, of course there's lore. Anyways, the thing to note about A Link to the Past is after the really awesome intro where three triangles come together and you got that story that comes out. I love that part.
Classical, to the point.
And there's something magical about it.
Very Arthurian.
I remember being about 2 years old when I first saw it, or like a year or two old. Our oldest brother played this game into the ground.
And as much as...
I got excited seeing that intro, just that initial soul down.
As much as in the era of the regular Nintendo and the Super Nintendo, being able to put music in games wasn't to the quality that we have today, a lot of it was still really good.
Yeah, c'est très magique. The Zelda theme is... Well, let's be honest. One of the strongest points of Zelda is the soundtrack. I've been hanging out in some of the Zelda discords lately, and it's everyone, oh yeah, I sometimes just listen to Zelda soundtrack when doing something else rather than always playing the game. There are some people who actually say that, and they just love the lore and whatnot, and they listen to the music. Not gonna judge. The music's awesome. I'm putting the Link to the Past theme song in the background of this video. You can tell how great it is. Anyways, what's great about the Link to the Past game is that this is the first time we get to see the origin of Hyrule recounted to us. And honestly, we are seeing video game history, and I'd even argue to an extent fantasy history being made here. And it is a truly grand story. What it says is, long ago in the beautiful kingdom of Hyrule. Wait, define beautiful. I'm kidding. Surrounded by mountains and forests. Just a little bit of info into why there's so much emphasis on forests and mountains here. For one thing, Miyamoto Shigeru, who was the main guy who wrote Legend of Zelda, used to go around in the forest playing with a stick and pretending to basically be a hero, which he complained, I think, once that in the modern age, you can't really go around and play in the forest like that anymore in Japan, but that's what he thinks. I've actually gone to Japan once upon a time. Actually, there are large spaces of forest with no one really there. And you can go around into the forests and play and whatnot. The only thing is you might run into rundown or semi-abandoned shrines that are called Terra, and they are beautiful. Japan is a land of big mountains and great highlands. And I know what you're thinking. No! Really? Yes, really, audience. I know you're going or duh, depending on your fantasy experiences. Anyone who's going I know you're a D&D or Pathfinder player.
And now we've discovered I'm a Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder player.
The thing to note is that the mountains this might be a reference to Miyamoto Shigeru's homeland, in that this is the mountains. Every piece of art is also a study in the creator's psychology to an extent. That being said, Hyrule was always meant to be a bit of a Celtic kind of society. And what could be more Celtic than forests and mountains? So already we're getting the mixture of Japan and the Celtic society of Hyrule being put together. That being said, long ago means this is a fairy story. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, or once upon a time. This is nowhere land. This is a land before any of our own. This is a land of myth and legend. And it's in a time of myth and legend even for the Hylians, who are actually elves. Elves being fairies themselves. And so you have here the land of elves. There is also a linguistic thing that's happening that's interesting. Hyrule. The land of HY is pronounced like HIGH. Rule, of course, we know how it's spelled, we know how it's pronounced. But it's a time of high rulers, of great rulers, such as Princess Zelda. And the Zelda in this game is truly great, let's be honest. It's a time when a great kingdom, and that's the idea. This is a mythical kingdom of great rulers and great men and women. So the myth here, just in the first sentence or the first paragraph that we see, is already magnificent in a way. I know this is a lot of detail to get into just on this first little bit, but this is how we want to do this podcast. We want to basically get into every nitty-gritty detail of Link to the Past, and also do this to all the other Zelda games in time. In the distance, in the image, you see the great mountains of Hyrule, and you see the Triforce far, far, far away, so that you need a telescope to see it. that's basically saying that, it's showing us a visual representation of the Triforce kind of descending down into the land of Hyrule, which we learn in Ocarina of Time. And it was basically put in, I know this game explains it's put in the Sacred Realm. In Ocarina of Time, you kind of go to the Sacred Realm and you get to see it to an extent, or at least an image of it. And Ocarina of Time is another great game. It does a great job building on the mythology and the lore. Now, the next sentence is legends told of an omnipotent and omniscient golden power that resided in a hidden land. The idea is that the divine power of the universe is called Force. Not the Force, just a Force, or Force. But the trouble is that you can't help but think of Star Wars. And you can see that they are borrowing from Star Wars with the words appearing on the screen, but they're not doing it words in the sky. It's basically words below the mountains? I don't know. But as to the legends, so that basically tells us that even in this mythical kingdom, it stretches all the way into yonder legends when this thing showed up. The story of the Triforce has been passed down for so long, they don't know who originally passed it down. Probably from the gods themselves. They're like, the Hylians who have no idea how far back it goes. They have no idea how far back their kingdom goes to an extent. And who could blame them? It goes for Skyward Sword is so far back into the past, it's ridiculous. When you compare it to the era of Ocarina of Time, I'm not sure that it's ever stated how many centuries or millennia it is. So if the Hylians are confused about it, not gonna judge. When you look at our own history, I believe it's Catalheok, which stretches back to 5,400 BC. So that is essentially 7,400 years before our current year. You look at the Scorpion Kings, they stretch back to about 5,000 BC to 3,200 BC, thereabouts. Actually, it'd probably be closer to 4,400 BC. But right there, that's about at least 6 to almost 7,000 years ago. And we know so little. That being said, we know a great deal more about Egypt and Greece and Rome and Persia and the Bronze Age because there were excellent records kept. There's still a lot we don't know, but there's a lot we do know. So the Hylians are essentially in the same situation. The Triforce being an omnipotent power, it's omnipotent. As for it being omniscient, the golden power is basically physical covenant between the gods, or the three golden goddesses, and the mortal realm. We don't know if the three golden goddesses are the first gods. There's a fan theory that there's a god older than, acts a bit like Hyrule, and that he's brought up, I think, in Skyward Sword or Twilight Princess. That's a fascinating idea. We'll have to do a separate video on that at some point. And it would require a lot more research on my part. But the three golden goddesses create the land and leave behind the golden Triforce. Now here, Miyamoto Shigeru, I know a lot of people look at the goddess Hylia, for example, as Amaterasu. And yeah, she is based off Amaterasu, except Hylia is more of a sky and sea goddess to an extent, given Lake Hylia is the main connecting point to an extent that we know of her because the lake's named after her. But she has heavenly connotations. She creates Skyloft. She tears it out of the earth. There's Zelda, and she's the ancestress of Hylian royal family. There you get the Jimmu Amaterasu connection. But the Triforce, one could look at it, in the Judeo-Christian sense of the Ark of the Covenant. In a way, it is proof of the covenant between the Judeo-Christian God and the Jewish people, the Israelites. And so here you have a similar connotation. You can also look at the mirror and the sword that are the imperial artifacts as being the covenant between Amaterasu and the Japanese people. Some cultures do have these covenant items. The Triforce is obviously that of the Hylian people, and it apparently resides in a hidden land. Well, obviously. So here we have an interesting connecting point between the gods and the mortal Hylians. The trouble is that it comes with the request, please don't tarnish it, honor it. To an extent. The trouble is, this doesn't happen. Initially, yes, it is honored, but in time, people forget. People are fickle. As stated, many people aggressively sought to enter the hidden golden land, so that there were a lot of wars to try to lay claim to the Triforce. The problem is that this essentially signals that although Hyrule, the kingdom of mythical great rulers and great people, it is still a fallen world in a way. This is rather like Studio Ghibli's interpretation of their mythological Japan, in that this is a fallen world in which all men and women are flawed. they are seeking the Great Boon to perfect their existence. They are seeking to elevate themselves and try to make it into, I guess you could say, heaven, as might understand most people who are familiar with the idea of the afterlife, as almost every religion has a concept of heaven, including the Japanese religions and Christianity and whatnot. And they fought aggressively and killed each other and despoiled, in a way, the Golden Land, when they were not supposed to do that. So that essentially the three golden goddesses gave them a test, and they failed. This is what it means. I imagine the initial generations of Hylians did not fight wars for it, but in time, as the generations went on, they in time grew to forget the covenant that existed between them and the golden goddesses. So this is how one could read the text here.
Got the great Camelot, and we end up in a war over Helen of Troy.
Or maybe even over the Cauldron of Ceridwen from Celtic myths. Technically, given Skyward Sword and how Demise, Girahim, your one rival, and Link are all fighting over her, a portion of Skyloft is brought back down to the earth, but to an extent, there is a lot of tragedy that happens, like the Trojan War. People are fighting over Zelda. And actually, I'll be honest, the Zelda in that game is very beautiful, both in character and physically. So that tragically, you do have a Helen of Troy incident there. But thankfully, it has a better ending than what Helen got. But no one ever returned. One day, evil power began to flow from the Golden Land. The Golden Land became corrupted and despoiled, as we mentioned. Now we get here the War of Sealing, the imprisoning war mentioned here. Here, I think it's specifying more the events of Ocarina of Time to an extent. That said, looking at this, we have to bear in mind that the timeline that this takes place in is where the hero fell. Link passed away at the hand of Ganon. There were the 7 sages who had to seal away Ganon. The gate to the land of the Golden Power, it was commanded shut by the king, Princess Zelda of Ocarina of Time's son. Because she's the last of the royal family, she had to have carried on the line. So she obviously found herself some other guy than Link. Or, well, she probably found herself a nobleman or something. One of the surviving nobles who probably supported her claim. Not that there's anyone to fight against, considering everybody's gone. The peasants are obviously still around, but of the nobility, very few left, considering Ganon. That being said, the king commanded 7 wise men to seal the gate to the land of the Golden Power. Yeah, we could say Zelda probably sealed it. Ganon, who was sealed away, and then evil began to flow out up from the Golden Land. You then had the king, Zelda's son, who by now was able to rule and had united the people of Hyrule. Well, she probably had to start the work, and then he carried on her work. He was probably the one who asked the 7 sages who had sealed Ganon to also seal the land of the Golden Power, with Zelda obviously contributing a great deal in that process, because we must never understate the influence of Zelda herself in Ocarina of Time and the 3 timelines that occur after Ocarina of Time. The seal was meant to last forever. Obviously didn't. That's the tragedy here. Obviously things got lost to the pages of history, and the king who followed after Zelda onto the throne was probably passed down the wisdoms his mother passed to him, but future generations proved less wise. By the time of A Link to the Past, it has been centuries, and things have been forgotten. The tragedies and sorrows of the age of Ocarina of Time have been lost. The imprisoning war is over. Ganon is sealed. The Triforce has been sealed away with the power of the 7 sages. And the descendants of the 7 sages are 7 maidens whom are basically blessed with the abilities of the sages in question. As for this Zelda, she's obviously a reincarnation of the previous Zelda, with Link in this game being the reincarnation of Ocarina of Time Link. But the events that are the backstory of this timeline are horrifying to think about. And it's what happens when Link fails. That's the scary part, which is a terrifying notion because, you want him to succeed and you see what happens if he doesn't. It's probably one of the only times in the 3 timelines you see what happens when he's not around to save the day. So obviously there are grave consequences to failure in this quest. With this king also being, it seems, a widow, as there's no queen occupying the throne next to him, at least at first glance, which probably leaves Zelda possibly a single child, which means the hopes and dreams of the royal family rest with her. And this Zelda shows herself to be no less wise than her predecessor, because she ends up quickly realizing she needs backup when she's in prison, because Aghanim soon launches a coup d'etat against her father. The thing is, Aghanim ends up eliminating the king in it, as said, in a coup d'etat, and the king was a good ruler, but Aghanim's a powerful mage who has the backing of Ganon, and Ganon has the Triforce of Power. So obviously, basically the king was way out of his league. As to Aghanim, the first thing he does when in power is to eliminate most of the lineages of the 7 sages. He's not leaving anything to chance. Clearly, he is frightened of them and seeks to destroy them so as to secure his power and the entry of his master back into the land of Hyrule, with Zelda being imprisoned. So he's got Zelda secure. He can't just eliminate her quite yet, but he clearly has plans to do so. Because if he's eliminated these 7 sages, the most powerful of the sages is obviously the royal family. And in times of trouble, it's often a princess called Zelda who comes to the rescue. One with the Triforce of Wisdom, which this Zelda pretty much has. So he's obviously got to make sure he gets rid of her. Time to be introduced to our 2 heroes. Zelda calls out one dark, stormy night, crying out to Link, "I am a prisoner in the dungeon of the castle. My name is Zelda." And with these quotes, the story is on. I know Legend of Zelda 1 and 2 were the real first games, but in some ways, the first game with a story that has the story of Hyrule, with the backstory, with the heroes, and has the basic themes and ideas of Hyrule, is this one. This is truly gaming and fantasy history in the making right here. It is interesting to note that Princess Zelda is not just simply calling through telepathy out to Link. She's calling out to his uncle. And I'll get to why that is in a minute. First off, she tells him that Aghanim has done something to the other missing girls and that Zelda's worried for them. So there's something interesting here. Now, we're going to touch on the culture of Hyrule between Ocarina of Time and this era. By this time, Hyrule has come to flourish again, which is hard to imagine when you look at how it's a post-apocalyptic world when you're an adult in Ocarina of Time. Yet it has come to flourish once again and become a beautiful kingdom, which just speaks to the wise rule of Zelda and her son. So the reason we have to say it that way is because this is a Celtic mythological kingdom where a lot of the good harvest comes from having the rightful monarch on the throne. Having a bad monarch on the throne, well, look at Ganon when in the adult time period of Ocarina of Time. Now, this is where it gets interesting. The implication is that the 7 sages, some of their descendants became nobles, or at least their daughters would serve as handmaidens to the queen or to the princess of Hyrule, so that we have a possible custom here. Always, Zelda would be attended to by 7 daughters of these 7 sages' bloodlines. They must have formed great houses, and large ones at that. Now only Zelda remains. So here's the thing though, these 7 maidens, she would have all but grown up with some of these girls. Zelda in this game is probably around like 17 or 18, and she has known these girls probably since girlhood. So pretty much all of her friends have disappeared, and she's imprisoned in the dungeon for being the princess by her own guards, who are now being mind controlled by Aghanim. Can you imagine how terrifying that would be?
Oh, lonely and cold.
And not fed. That is not how you treat a lady.
And that would break some people.
But not this Zelda.
That shows her strong will.
Yes.
And she's crying out of desperation.
Zelda explains that Aghanim is trying to break down the seal of the 7 sages, and that he's trying to get to the Triforce, and that he's already taken control of the castle, which this is probably information Aghanim would not be happy about it being slipped out. On the other hand, the implication is that the castle has been shrouded in secrecy for probably a few days. It's at least in the past week that the castle was seized and that the king was done away with. So the implication here is that Aghanim maybe suddenly stormed the castle, or at least if he was a court mage beforehand, suddenly took control, and this is when his plans are coming to fruition. Zelda asks her potential rescuers, please hurry, and the immediate response when Link wakes up from this dream is one of surprise, but his uncle immediately tells him, Link, I'm going out for a while. I'll be back by morning. Don't leave the house. The message seems to have been directed at everyone within that vicinity, with Link's uncle obviously getting the message and deciding to grab a sword and shield and hurry out there. Link's uncle was a former member of the Hylian Guards, and he sees it as his duty to go rescue the princess because obviously somebody's got to come to the rescue. Link's uncle is a man who's obviously a veteran of many conflicts, a man of formidable will. Apparently Link was an orphan, and Link's uncle, who was a sibling of one of his parents, took him in and trained him in how to fight and how to survive, probably with the intention that Link should maybe become a guard and follow in his footsteps. He is not a man of high status, but he is a man of formidable will and strength, and was once probably a great warrior.
He's also a man that values duty and loyalty.
Because he took in his family member's son. But he also has such a strong sense of duty and loyalty that Aghanim could not possess him if he tried. And he has tried to basically possess all the guards. dear sweet uncle ventures off into the underground passages below the castle, and we have to understand that the castle was a rebuilt castle of that from Ocarina of Time. Basically, there was no castle left after Ganondorf destroyed it at the end of Ocarina of Time, so Zelda of that game had to have someone rebuild it. Kudos to her for actually having the strength to do that. That being said, Uncle here rushes off and is sadly mortally wounded by Aghanim and passes along his shield and sword to Link, telling him, "You're the only one who can do it now. You have to rescue Zelda." Link, despite his grief for the only father he ever knew, has to venture into danger and rescue the princess. This is akin to Star Wars with Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru, but the difference is that, unlike Uncle Owen, who was a little abusive towards Luke, Link's uncle is not at all abusive. What's more is that Zelda is obviously familiar with him and knows about him because she called out to Link's uncle. Likely he was a bit of a hero himself in his own right for Hyrule, probably having served and then having been recompensed.
In his first line, we see what the uncle values.
Link.
Don't leave the house.
He's obviously more worried for Link than anyone else, except maybe the princess to an extent. He's willing to go risk his life for the princess, but he's not willing to risk Link's until he's dying and he realizes he has no one else to trust the princess to. On the other hand, having ended such a great man, Aghanim becomes completely cocky. Because Aghanim was there, but then he obviously became so confident that, well, I just dispatched the only guy who could fight me. I guess I don't have to worry about the princess's security. I'm going to go off and complete my rituals. When, if he had just stayed a bit longer, Hyrule's hope would have been snuffed out. But that's not what happens. He got cocky, he ran off to go do what he had to, and Link is entrusted with the fate of Hyrule itself. Thematically, this is a boy's own story. Basically, it's a coming-of-age story. It's a Bildungsroman tale, and it truly is Celtic. In Celtic stories, there's often a trend of a young boy who has to prove himself worthy, find a magic light sword, and save a princess, frequently marrying her at the end, sometimes not. But as you can see, there's a lot of Celtic themes. Miyamoto Shigeru was a very well-educated man in the classics, but I suspect he may have also gotten himself a good education in Celtic literature and folklore, and that there might have been some stories translated into Japanese so that he could read it. But either way, his ability to capture the feel of Ireland and Scotland is incredible. Honestly, he captures the feel of their stories and mythology better than some writers of Celtic descent. But on the other hand, he mixes a crucial amount of Japanese folklore and mythology with it, so that it only strengthens it and heightens the otherworldly beauty of Hyrule. So with that said, hope you enjoyed this video and our detailed analysis of the opening minutes of A Link to the Past. Next time, we're going to get to the rescue of Princess Zelda and the escape from the castle. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to smash that like and that subscribe button as though you were Link putting an end to Ganon.